Hi everybody, my name is Rosie Meade, and with my colleague Orla Donovan, I'm one of the co-editors of the Community Development Journal. I'm delighted to welcome you to the CDJ YouTube channel today for the second in our series of interviews around the topic and theme of territorial stigmatisation. If you're familiar with the journal already, you'll know that in spring 2021, we published a theme section of the journal that was entitled Territorial Stigmatisation, Theory and Practice and its Implications for Community Development. This series of interviews is designed to give you a sense and a synopsis of the content of the articles published in that theme section, but it's also an opportunity for you to meet with the authors and to get a sense of the interests and ideas that are informing their analysis. I suppose the other idea really is that it's a way of introducing you to some of the theoretical concepts, and it's a way of promoting the idea of theory for community development. And we really hope that by watching and listening today, you'll also be enticed into reading the articles and engaging more directly with the content of the CDJ. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Alice Butler-Warke, who is a critical human geographer and a lecturer in sociology in Robert Gordon University in Scotland. Alice's research interests focus on discourses and power, urban experience and marginality, the process of stigmatisation and urban materiality. And her work is widely published and has been included in journals such as Critical and Radical Social Work, British Journal of Sociology, and Transactions for the Institute of British Geographers, and of course the Community Development Journal. I'm also delighted to say that Alice has recently joined the board of the CDJ, so we'll have the pleasure of working with her over the long haul. Alice, thank you so much for coming along. And today we're going to largely focus on your recent article that was published in the CDJ, which is called There's a Time and a Place, Temporal Aspects of Place-Based Stigma. And on the YouTube channel, we're going to provide links back to the article on the CDJ website. So as I said, we strongly encourage people to read the article. It's very good. And it's a great introduction to that kind of whole literature around territorial stigmatisation as well. So thank you for joining us. You're based in Scotland, I'm in Cork, so we're having an officially international exchange today.
Thank you.
So Alice, I suppose just to start off a little bit, can you talk us through your own research interests a little bit more? I mean, they seem quite expansive. Could you tell us a little bit about the scope of them, and then maybe why and how you became interested in community development in particular?
Sure. And first of all, thank you for having me along for this. It's really exciting. I think my interests really are, as you said before, they focus on issues around sort of discourse and power, place-based stigma, urban experience, that kind of thing. And while they do seem disparate in some ways, they do actually tie together, because I'm particularly interested in the way that people talk about and the messages that we're given about how to think about certain places and spaces. And particularly interested in, overly simplified, but essentially why people don't like certain places, why certain places get a bad reputation, and what that means for communities and the people who live there. Mm-hmm. A lot of the work I've done has been looking at media stigmatisation of certain areas and sort of elite voices who stigmatise certain places. I've done a lot of work about Toxteth in Liverpool and how Toxteth has been stigmatised by the media over the course of the 20th century. And I'm sure we'll touch on some of that a little bit as we go on. I think in terms of the link with community development, it's thinking about the fact that it's all very well studying the sort of how a community gets stigmatized, how a place comes to get that bad reputation, but what does it actually mean for the people who live there? What's the experience that they have? How does their lived reality change? And I think it's interesting to think about. I know you made the observation in the introduction to the theme about the sort of position that community development can take. It can either be seen as that kind of collective action approach, or it can be seen as more of a politicized way of governing a particular group of people. And I think the way that I came at it was really the former, thinking about how we respond collectively to places being stigmatized and how we can give a voice to different communities so that communities can represent themselves and put forward an image of the place that they want to be put forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think that idea of that the one of the bases for the government of communities can be these stigmatized representations. And I think that's very common, and mm-hmm. Actually there's a very strong thread of that is run across kind of the whole kind of idea of even colonization and colonialism historically, that certain places, peoples within places who are stigmatized, and then that gives us a license to intervene in particular kind of ways. And to me, one of problematic forms of community development is community development that that takes that position. And I think, yes, absolutely, I can see the connection with the kind of the concept of stigma, even if community development people aren't necessarily using that precise term to describe what they're actually doing, you know?
Yeah, and it's, yeah.
And you mentioned as you were talking there, you have a particular interest. I have had a particular interest in Toxteth in Liverpool, and I suppose it'd be really interesting, like, what drew you to that? What drew you to the idea of researching Toxteth, and why you think that was, you know, that was necessary to have some kind of committed scholarship around the experiences of that community?
It actually goes back to when I was quite little. I grew up not far from Liverpool, and I was always, even as a child, which possibly says more about me as a child, fascinated by the way that people talked about Toxteth. And it was always the sense that you got of sort of raised eyebrows if you said you were going to be going through Toxteth to get somewhere, or just this sort of really cagey responses to any discussion about the place. And as a child, obviously because of that reputation, we didn't go often. But when we did go, it didn't seem to match what people were talking about. And even as a child, I was quite aware of the fact that they tended to focus on the riots or the uprisings as the sort of focal point. But then there'd be discussions about, oh, it's never been a good place. And it really, my fascination with Toxteth really stemmed from that kind of childhood experience and hearing about places and what people talked about and how they gave places a bad reputation. And when I took a circuitous route but came to do my PhD in geography, and I was going to be looking at stigmatized places, I knew the only place really that made sense for me to think about was Toxteth, to finally answer the question that childhood Alice had and sort of really figure out what was going on. There has been a lot of study of Toxteth, and I was quite conscious that I didn't want to contribute to the sort of research fatigue of, you know, flying into a community and just sort of asking lots of questions. And really, we have a good understanding of what the lived reality of life in Toxteth is like. And people like Diane Frost and Gemma Catney, Leona Vaughan are doing some brilliant work at the moment about the lived experiences in Liverpool 8 or Toxteth. What hadn't really been answered, and that particularly for Toxteth, but more generally in relation to the stigmatization process, was thinking about those elite voices and the formation of stigma. And therefore, I really wanted to take that different approach to it and think about, okay, we know what the lived reality is if you live in a stigmatized place. We know the knock-on effects that it has. But how do we get there? Like, where does this stigma come from that people are having to endure? So that's really where that came from. And I think I'd like to hope that as we think more about the formation of stigma, we can kind of piece this puzzle together and think about, well, we can have a sense of how it forms. We know that it forms at different times and different periods and in different ways. And then we can get an understanding of how we can hopefully change it, because ultimately that's what we really want to do. We want to make things better, I would hope.
Yeah, I think that sounds really impressive, because I suppose because stigma can be so pervasive, it can be repeated so much, it can almost become naturalized. So you almost imagine that it emerges out of a place. Do you know, for what you're describing it's political construct, it's a social construct, it's an ideological construct. And, you know, where does that come from? And I do think that one of the responsibilities of community work is to try and challenge the kind of foundational assumptions of government, to kind of look at, you know, ideology and to look at discourse as it pertains to communities, and maybe to kind of deconstruct it and to challenge it. So, I mean, certainly what you're describing there resonates with that. And it's interesting, I mean, that whole experience as well, you talk about like children and kind of the child's eye, like, why is this going on? But it's funny, I come from Limerick, which has been a similarly stigmatized place in Ireland. And certainly the kind of jadedness you can experience of hearing the kind of recurring tropes and stereotypes. And I'm sure that you're probably hearing the same things in relation to, you know, like, and it is like, how do we bust the balloon of this kind of complacency that people have in relation to it, you know? So yeah, it seems like it's a very kind of powerful motivation, that childhood interest, that it doesn't quite go away, maybe, you know?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So I suppose when we invited you to participate in the theme section, I suppose one of the kind of ideas we had was that you would provide a kind of bird's eye view of the academic scholarship on territorial stigmatization, and you do that brilliantly. It's a fantastic introductory piece for anybody who is wanting to come at this topic and to get an anchoring in it and to get a sense of the state of the art of the scholarship on territorial stigmatization. And I suppose one of the people whose work you were engaging with by doing that was Wacquant. And because he has played such, I suppose, that term territorial stigmatization is very much associated with him. And then also, I suppose, the subsequent scholarship, a lot of it, you know, is quite deliberately speaking repeating back to him and kind of extending and, you know, like maybe adapting elements of his analysis. I suppose for the benefit of our researchers, Alice, would you mind just talking a little bit about like what you see as the contribution of Wacquant in that regard, like where his theory has taken us, what kind of insights it gives us, and what's maybe useful from the perspective maybe of a community development readership?
Yeah, I think the first time I encountered Wacquant's work, I found it really, as I mentioned, I'd taken a circuitous route, and coming up against Wacquant's writing made me realise that this was the angle I could actually start to think about the questions I'd been wondering about. What Wacquant does, and particularly if anyone's interested in sort of starting out with Wacquant's work, I'd recommend Urban Outcasts, his book from 2008, I believe, as a really accessible way of understanding the process.
If you want to cross the bookshelf now and pull it off and show it, but I won't.
I've lent mine to somebody, so I can't. Just the sense of what he refers to as advanced marginality. So for Wacquant, he essentially marries together Goffman and Bourdieu, and he talks about the Bourdieusian idea about symbolic violence, and he ties that together with Goffman's understanding of stigma, but argues that Goffman talks about a lot of different kinds of stigma, but doesn't actually talk about stigmatization of place. And he talks about how there's this perpetuation, as you mentioned before, this sort of political economic framing and a social construction of a place, which perpetuates and kind of does violence to an area, both structurally, symbolically, over time. And Wacquant's argument is that we need to consider the stigmatization of place. He argues that territorial stigma forms one of 6 types or 6 features of advanced marginality. And for me, territorial stigma was the most relevant to what I was engaging with. But essentially, his thesis is that since 1980, the world has changed significantly, society has changed, and spaces and places have changed. And that as a result of the decline in the welfare state and as a result of an increasing neoliberal society, we have an increase in a new form of marginality, and also, as part of that, a form of stigmatization of place. You didn't ask me to, but I can say, sort of, I'm sure we'd get to this, that one of the critiques that I raise in the piece, and more generally in some of my other work, is this idea that this is very much focused on a sort of Western lens from the minority world, and it's very much focused on stigma suddenly starts in 1980. And the argument I make is that not really. There are different types of stigma, and I think if we are suggesting that stigma comes in 1980 and it just begins one morning, then we're doing a disservice to understanding the stigmatization of place. And I would argue that for community workers, people interested in community development, it's really important that we see the full picture and all of the nuances of the types of stigma. It's ultimately all about understanding. The more that we understand, the more that we can change things and make things better for individual communities, and give tools to those communities to make things better, really. So I think Wacquant's contribution can't be underestimated. It's been, as you say, all the contributions that have come since essentially speak back to Wacquant and his original framing of advanced marginality and territorial stigma. But I think we're seeing that the debate is moving a little bit more into thinking about some of the other ways that we can think about stigma.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And I think I mean, what comes through as well, and what you're saying there, is this kind of conception of violence. Do you know what I mean? Like that what is being done through stigmatization is the perpetuation of a particular kind of violence, you know? And obviously Bourdieu and this notion of symbolic violence is really important there. And I find that notion of violence very powerful and very strong, actually. I think we need to sort of, you know, remember that, and that it's not just discursive in, you know, sticks and stones won't break my bones kind of stuff. It's actually, do you know what I mean? It's actually also has material effects. So it's, you know, the violence doesn't just exist within the language and, you know, how people are spoken about, but that it also plays out in the experiences of your economy, of job seeking, of relationship with law and order. Do you mean all these other dimensions of it? So I think you brought that out very strongly, that notion of violence. Do you know what I mean? You know, like that it is a violence that is being done to places, and also can be internalized within them as well if they take it on, you know?
Exactly. And I think, and again, I'm sure we'll probably get to this, about the different kinds of stigma, but regardless really of the type of stigma, once a stigmatization has touched an area, it's so difficult to remove it. It becomes really sticky and it adheres to the area. And as a result, the violence is perpetuated and, as you say, internalized, and it becomes more and more difficult to kind of shake that off an area. And as you say, it does have significant detrimental effects for the place, for investment in the area, for the way that it's thought of and perceived. And it has very, very real effects for the people living in that area and for the place itself.
Absolutely, because I think that even trying to sort of counter it puts you automatically in a position of defensiveness. Do you know what I mean? You know, and sort of like, so what are you so chippy about? Do you know what I mean? You know, like, why are Liverpudlians seem to be, you know what I mean? Like this kind of, you're constantly caught in the cycle of being, you know, having to defend yourself against a slur. Do you know what I mean? You know, like, and even when that slur is not articulated at that precise moment in time, it exists out there as a kind of framing device for everything else, doesn't it?
That's true. And I think one of the biggest challenges that comes with studying stigma is how you talk about a place without stigmatizing it, which possibly sounds a bit counterintuitive. But if you think about it, even going back historically, we see somebody like Engels, who wrote about the condition of the working class in Manchester. And he was doing that, we would believe, for benevolent reasons, to kind of highlight the conditions that people were enduring. But in doing so, in attempting to make that a lively and realistic image for readers, you can't help but stigmatize an area. So how do we as academics and community workers talk about places and give a realistic portrayal of what life is like, what people are enduring, without actually further stigmatizing the place? And that's something that I think is going to be a perennial issue and something that's going to be very, very difficult to counter. And that's why I do suggest in one point that we need to actually think about non-stigmatized areas, or areas with a different reputation, so that we can understand the process better. Because if we take that step back, understand the process, then perhaps we can come at it a slightly different way and start to think about it from a different angle.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that is that tightrope that community activists constantly, you know, walk. You know, how do we call attention to the structural inequalities? How do we call attention to oppression that we're experiencing without being blamed for it? And that's one of the tricky things at this historical moment. And it's a kind of a perspective that's very much reinforced by the kind of taken for grantedness of neoliberal ideas, the assumption that people who kind of at the end of oppression or experience, you know, profound inequality, structural inequality, are actually somehow responsible for it. That's, you know what I mean? That perception is very live, and it's very, you know, it's very real in terms of like how people vote in elections. You know, this kind of perception that people who are poor or who are living in areas that are devoid of services, you know, are somehow culpable in that, you know, in that absence. And so how do you speak back to that without kind of, on the other hand, reinforcing the kind of stereotypical assumptions about those places?
Yeah, I think that is the issue. And I would argue that, and perhaps this is an oversimplification to an extent, but I think it's a good place to start, is that one of the ways that we can do this is, if we're talking about a place, is to, I don't know, if you're looking at policy in a particular area, you have to make sure that you're involving people from that area, and that it isn't just that kind of mosquito research where you embed yourself and you never actually give anything back to the community, or in the case of the press, that you never actually go to the area that you're reporting from. And this is something that's come up a lot in my work, that when the media portray Toxteth, they weren't actually ever necessarily in Toxteth. They might have been writing from London. Therefore, they were never going to interview people from Toxteth. They were only ever going to interview officials that could be easily contacted from London or from outside Toxteth. So if we can get to a position where reporting about a place, or policy interventions about an area, or activism is actually engaging with the community, I think that's a really important place to start. And I would argue that's really the basis for a lot of social science research, that if we're researching people, then it's got to have engagement with those people. And obviously it's not going to be appropriate for every situation. I mean, when you're looking at, say, elite voices, there are different questions and different types of things that you want to be looking at. But generally, it requires an investment of time and a willingness to listen, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, yeah, I mean, certainly, like in terms of the content of the CDJ, I suppose some of the ways that community also try to kind of take back the message about their areas, you know, through, for example, community arts activities, you know, through demanding and clamoring for spaces in, you know, in local government, you know, reform units, or in, you know, in regeneration agendas and various other kind of mechanisms. But that's a long arduous, tough battle as well. Do you know what I mean? You know, like, but it's certainly, you know, that one of the ways that perhaps some of that stigma can be countered at the governmental level is by ensuring that there are opportunities for local people to participate in nuanced, rounded ways. Do you know what I mean? You know, in what have been said and done about their areas.
That's true. Again, one of the challenges when you think about Toxteth in the 1980s was that you did have that sense of there was going to be investment through the kind of Minister for Merseyside and Michael Heseltine kind of approach for things. But because Toxteth was so heavily stigmatised as this social construction and had been so disinvested for so long, the actual money that then went to the city didn't go to Toxteth. It went to everywhere except Toxteth, which just perpetuated the same situation. So it's as you mentioned before, it comes back to this idea that the stigmatisation of a place has such intense material effects and consequences that it's really hard to break out of that cycle.
Mm-hmm. Just going back to the Wacquantian kind of theorization of it then, and we've already kind of circled this a little bit, is that your preference for the stigmas that adhere to place or place-based stigma? I think that's your preferred term. And maybe would you clarify a little bit why you think that is important, that you're drawing a certain line of distinction between yourself and Wacquant in that regard, and that you think, and you already referred to the idea of the kind of temporalities that he uses and he assumes pertain to stigma. So that seems like a really interesting line of discussion.
Yeah, I think my argument for using place-based stigma is that it's really an umbrella term. It's talking about all of the types of stigma that can adhere to place. And particularly if we're thinking about it in a temporal sense, I think there are two kinds of stigma that can come about. So I would talk about core stigma and event stigma, which is a concept that's often used in kind of business and marketing literature. And there it might be referring to an event stigma relating to if there was a fire in a particular factory. That factory or that business might be stigmatized for a while. The core stigma is the actual attributes of that business. So examples used are things like casinos, brothels, this kind of stuff. All of the places that essentially are usually subject to a not in my backyard kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So if we think about that, there's these two kinds of stigmas going on, and I would argue that places can be subject to either. And there's some great work about Gloucester being subject to event stigma in relation to the Fred West killings, that up until that point there had been no background stigma essentially that had really tarnished Gloucester, but one event comes along and it's suddenly known for a particular thing. An example that we might see right now is Wuhan in China, that everybody suddenly knows Wuhan because that's where coronavirus originated, but that was an event. And at some point, I argue, event stigma does fade. Now, if you mention Gloucester, not everybody immediately thinks of Fred West. And hopefully in several years, when you mention Wuhan, people won't necessarily think of coronavirus. I think if you're talking simply about territorial stigma, it tends to, because of Wacquant's contribution to the field, focus simply on that type of stigma that's associated with advanced marginality and the post-Fordist, post-1980s kind of approach to the stigmatization of place. But there is stigma that comes before that. It's different, and I completely agree with Wacquant that it's a very intense type of stigma that comes about in the territorial stigma, advanced marginality era. But prior to that, there's a form of, I call foundational stigma, that is a bit like core stigma. It's this background, just always there, kind of rumbling away stigma that may never go anywhere, or if an event comes along, suddenly magnifies it. And then you have this intense stigma, as in the case of Toxteth. Toxteth's core or foundational stigma was rumbling in the background because it was an area of diversity, quite a low income area. And for several centuries, it was kind of rumbling along. And then suddenly you have the uprisings come along in the 1980s. That's the event. And it really transforms at that point into the territorial stigma that Wacquant talks about. So really, I think referring to place-based stigma is just a way of saying and acknowledging the fact that territorial stigma of the era of advanced marginality is not the only form of stigma that adheres to place. The stuff that comes before that, there's different types, different intensities. And I think if we just talk about territorial stigma, we lose that nuance. Mm-hmm. So that's why I prefer the term place-based stigma. I think it just covers more.
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's a more capacious term in the sense of, and presumably also allows for the differences across, I mean, international differences, that we're not necessarily talking about the same kind of political economic arrangements, the same kind of, transition towards neoliberalism in every context. So we need to sort of like be aware of that. So by having a kind of that broader, looser term, you allow for that diversity to become manifest. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would also think that, as you say, if we're thinking about the kind of Wacquantian approach that tends to focus on minority world cities or communities within cities, it's very much focused at that particular scale. And as you say, if you open that up to place-based stigma, it's thinking about the way that we talk about different countries. It's thinking about the way that stigma operates, as you said, at a global scale, rather than just located in the cities of Europe and the United States. And it really opens it up further so that we can make use of that term without the connotation of it being linked solely to one type of political economy.
Yeah, and I think it also allows for, I mean, the idea of place-based stigma allows for the idea that the stigmas may adhere to place and around place, but they may not originate in place solely, that there may be other dynamics going on there as well. So there may be like processes of racism and racialization, for example, that are actually going on within this. I imagine that's kind of allows that kind of analysis to come through as well. Yeah. So it seems to me to be a very useful way of kind of moving the discussion on and to allowing, I suppose, more scope for that kind of international exchange as well that we've been really talking about. I'm kind of very interested as well in the discussion we kind of began a little while ago, and that was around the idea that you have this kind of twin track approach, and with maybe it's worth coming back to it again, this idea that on the one hand we need to better understand the places that are not stigmatized. Okay. And on the other hand, we need to catch ourselves or watch ourselves in how we actually engage in scholarship or how we talk about the places that are stigmatized. And those two things are obviously related to each other. I mean, it kind of has resonance for me of the dictum of kind of we need to research up more than down, do you know, as well, in terms of like a kind of an ethics of research. Have you kind of seen research, or how might that be possible to do, particularly that in relation to the places that aren't stigmatized, and what we could learn from that, and where that might actually take us, what kind of an agenda for research that would actually kind of, create?
I think there are a lot of avenues it could take, and I'd like to hope that people take very creative approaches to thinking about how we can think about non-stigmatized areas or areas that have a different reputation. I think there has been some literature that's come out in relation to the neighborhoods effect kind of study, where it's been more of a comparative approach of comparing two areas and how people perceive each other in relation to a non-stigmatized area and a stigmatized area, which in principle I think is excellent, because it does allow you to have that comparison and allows you to see how two groups of people are seeing each other. But that assumes really that two communities are completely monolithic and that there is no real variation in the populations in those communities. So that has problems as well. I think perhaps just kind of spitballing ideas, ethnographic research that takes time, which again obviously feeds into bigger kind of neoliberal questions about time and the availability thereof. But I think ethnographic research that actually involves a long commitment to an area, whether that's a stigmatized or a non-stigmatized area, an area that's got a reputation for being particularly wealthy or particularly middle class or something like that. I think there are lots of avenues that people could start at. I mean, things like the Waitrose effect is an interesting one to look at, about how there's high brand supermarkets or high brand shops in certain areas. Why are they there? What do people think in that area? But again, it's assuming, and it connects to the argument you were making before about essentially thinking about the ethics of research. What are we trying to achieve? What are we actually hoping to accomplish through this? And also bearing in mind the fact that we're researching place, we're researching a topic that has impact on people's lives, and thinking about the fact that the communities, whether it's a non-stigmatized community or a stigmatized community, isn't that monolithic sort of thing. Everybody has a different experience in that area. So I think it's a challenging area to go into. And the thing that kind of springs to mind really is thinking about ethnographic lived experience type research. I don't feel like it's necessarily something that you can capture purely with quantitative research, though I think there is a space controversially, for some kind of quantitative analysis of outcomes for people's lives. Obviously, that's not getting to the root cause of how an area becomes stigmatized or not stigmatized, but we can start to see the effects, which can then help us go back and see, well, where did that come from? So I think we need to be constantly looking forward, we need to be looking backwards, and I'm a huge advocate for historical research in terms of looking back to trying to figure out where something started so that we can plan forward better, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. I was looking at a documentary there, an Irish documentary called The Fourth Act. I don't know if you've come across it. And it's a documentary that was made about a place in Dublin, Ballymon, that was subjected to a kind of a big regeneration scheme. And Ballymon was established in the 1960s as the kind of the first, public housing high-rise program in Ireland. And it was an area that was allowed, the state kind of neglected once the big modernist claims about how this is going to be transformative and it was the, bright new future. Once that waned, the state then pretty much, did very little to kind of maintain and support residents in it. And then the answer was regeneration, the rehousing of residents. But the Fourth Act is a really interesting documentary, and because what it does is it actually, it presents the discourses of the people involved in planning and housing and regeneration about the way that they talk about that particular area and the kind of assumptions. And I mean, having, I suppose, come at fresh from my kind of reading and thinking about territorial stigmatization, place-based stigma, I could really see the kind of assumptions, the kind of value-laden ideas. And it's quite arresting actually to think in that kind of theoretical frame and then to look at something like that. So it does really show the power of theory actually. But what it also does, what's really interesting, is that the documentary makers have assembled all of this kind of archival footage from the local community. So you have scenes of people just kicking balls around, playing snooker, going to a funeral, all this sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And what's amazing to me about it is it brings this sort of it's an answering back to the kind of so it's not didactically saying we're not what you think we are, we've got so much else going on. So rather than saying that didactically, it actually presents it through this format. And it really does show to me the power of maybe the ethnographic work that you're talking about, produced by communities themselves or in collaboration with researchers, whatever it is, in terms of we will not be reduced. We will not be reduced to the stigma that you kind of are putting on us. We refuse this. And in that documentary, I think it's done really, really well, because it is answered back through people's lives are complicated. And even in communities where there are issues of inequality and oppression, there's all kind of interesting dynamics going on, and we will not and cannot be reduced in the way that the stigma does. So it certainly would tally with the kind of thing that you're talking about there, I think.
Yeah, I think it is a question of having the time to invest in particular areas, which a sort of slow research approach really, to a real investment in an area, to really thinking and engaging, which obviously doesn't really lend itself to the situation that we're in necessarily at the moment. Yeah. But working with communities, finding out what communities want to know. Maybe they're not necessarily aware of the overtness of stigma. Maybe they think of it in a different way, and being flexible enough to think about the different ways that we frame things and the different ways that communities frame things, I think is important as well. And I've also written down the name of that so I can look up the documentary you mentioned.
It's really interesting. It's very powerful, I think, in terms of showing us what I consider to be the kind of stigmatizing assumptions, but on the other hand, this just through this sort of very moving old style footage as well of actually, don't reduce people in this way that you're doing. There is much more going on here, and it is very, very moving, I have to say. Just, I suppose that takes us on maybe to the kind of the last kind of theme I want to talk about, and that's the whole area of resistance. And we've touched on that a little bit. To what extent have you seen, communities, first of all, consciously, actively try to resist processes of territorial stigmatization or place-based stigma? And secondly, have you seen them do that effectively? How has that been, done maybe in a way that does in some way push back or counter it? Or do you think that communities get ground down by the process of stigmatization, and so they end up, not accepting it, but perhaps not necessarily always knowing how to fight back?
I think there's mixed literature on this, and I think there's an increasing acknowledgement that the sort of ground down narrative, while it might be true for some people and for some people's individual kind of dynamics, does reduce people's agency to an extent. And we see that people aren't really given any agency in that discussion, and not assumed to have any kind of, again, contested term, but resilience to a situation. And I think there is some excellent work that comes about regarding that. Teresa Caldera's work about marginality is really good from that sense, about arguing for the sense of thinking about agency within communities. So it is important to think about what individual communities are doing. Within Toxteth, there's many wonderful community organisations. There's one that's particularly well known that I'm just actually features in a book chapter I'm just submitting, called the Granby 4 Streets. And basically Granby being an area of Toxteth that's much smaller than Toxteth, it's limited to a much smaller area. And the community events that they do there, the sort of cooperative arrangements that happen in that area, the markets that they host, and just the general increasing publicity of the area for something good and for something community-based. And Granby 4 Streets has a huge sort of collective action approach to how we can make things better, how we can improve things because it's interesting that in Toxteth you have, there have been streets of houses that for years, they're known as the Welsh streets, have been kind of subject to various debates about, are they going to be knocked down, are they going to be regenerated, gentrified, whatever, and then they were eventually bought by private developers. And Granby 4 Streets really sits as a community land trust in stark opposition to the sort of faceless rebranding of an area and just brand it differently, everything will be better kind of thing. And Granby 4 Streets actually gets to the heart of something. So I think collective action and community action is fantastic and has a good way of highlighting resilience. And I think that's another thing that we can understand from talking to people and from getting a sense of what individual people are doing to counter things, because it doesn't always have to be grand actions that actually change things. In terms of what we can all do more generally, and again, I sound like I'm about to suck the fun out of everything every time I say this, one of the things that really bothers me is the way that places become butts of jokes, and that a huge amount of humour in the UK, and I think once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere, is about people from a particular place are X, people from this place are Y. And it becomes a shorthand. And Kirstine Payton's work talks about how the stigmatisation of place becomes a shorthand for stigmatisation of class or race, or it's become a socially acceptable way of stigmatising people. So while I'm not saying we all need to change our humour, and I'm trying to suggest that we'll become humourless automatons, I'm thinking that we really need to think carefully when we're engaging in those kinds of jokes about the effects that it has on people. We need to think about the language that we're using, but also, interestingly, some of the resistance that people use to counter the dominant narratives is an engagement with that humour. And it's a really complicated story of who has the right to stigmatise a place. And sometimes it's used as a coping strategy by people within the area. That's something we discovered in our work about shitholes, that people using the word shithole could use it about their own place because it's my shithole. Nobody else has the right to call it that, but it's my place and I can call it that. But should that come kind of top down or from other people? So I think it's really tricky. It's more about thinking about the language that we use, thinking really about the effects that our actions and our words have. So I guess that all ties back to my interest in discourse and power, that what we're talking about has real life consequences, and thinking about how we resist, whether that's as a community that's resisting the stigma that's been put upon us through humour, through actually, a community land trust, or through a large community movement, is one way of doing it. But as people who aren't necessarily living in a stigmatised area, how can we resist as well? How can we change things? And that can come through a careful consideration of the narratives that we perpetuate, the myths about places that we perpetuate, even little things like, if you know somebody who's moving to a new area and you engage in that, I wouldn't live there, that street's a bit dodgy kind of narrative. It has a real knock-on effect for people's lives. So it's just a matter, I think, of being really careful and speaking about what you know, rather than feeding into that kind of mythologization of place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that what you're doing there as well is you're kind of giving us kind of like, I suppose, possibilities for community work to kind of like take on this. Do you know? So
Mhm.
it can range from the sort of the, the kind of like the more big scale, obviously politicized kind of work around land trust about maybe, confronting process of gentrification, but also it can work down to even the kind of interrelational, do you know, like the kind of everyday personal stuff of like how we conduct, how we talk about other people, how we talk about places that we've never actually been, most of us, do
Yeah.
you know, but have very strong views of. And so how we, and I think that notion of humor as being a kind of the kind of canary in the coal mine for a lot of stigmatization, I think is really important, because that's certainly in terms of like a place like Limerick, which is, as I mentioned, is very stigmatized in the context of the Republic of Ireland. A lot of the jokes about Limerick would have been, do you know, about that? And people would say jokingly, oh, you're from Limerick, that's Stap City, or some kind of rubbish like
Mhm.
this. You're thinking, you've never been there, obviously, you know what you're talking about. But the humor
Mhm.
became the way of doing that, expressing that stigma in a socially acceptable way. So it does strike me as a place we need to be thinking and acting
Mhm.
about, acting on, as well as people involved in the community. Yeah.
Yeah, and even little things like the stock images that are used in publications about a particular area often have overwhelmingly stigmatizing narratives included in them, and the tag phrases or descriptors that we use in a city, sink estate, these kinds of terms have huge meaning behind them. So just being aware of the fact that when we throw around terms like inner city, we're actually talking about and constructing in other people's minds this idea of a deviant, racialized, poor area, and that has huge manifestations for people, and that's something definitely that I think community workers can be aware of, that just thinking about what words mean, what phrases mean, and when working with communities, how communities want to be represented.
And what language they want to use themselves to describe
Yeah,
themselves.
yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Alice, that's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for taking the time to have
Thank you.
with us. I mean, I really strongly encourage everybody watching to go to the article and to go to your other articles. I mean, you mentioned the shithole article there. Maybe we should give it its correct title, or can you think of the title offhand?
What do we have for a shithole? What do people mean when they call a place a shithole?
Exactly. And that's a really fascinating piece of work, because you're looking at Twitter, aren't you? You're looking at how people have, talk about shitholes in the context of Twitter. And again, this idea that sometimes people use that designation to talk about their own places.
That's right.
So listen, it's been fantastic. So thank you again. I'm going to stop recording now so we can sort of say goodbye properly. But as I said, we really strongly encourage anybody listening to engage directly with the article.
Thank you.